None dared to help a wounded Comanche, until a widow realized he once carried her through a blizzard. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. The wind howled across the desolate plains of the American frontier, its cold breath cutting through the night like the sharpest of knives. It was the dead of winter, and the unforgiving snowstorm had already claimed its victims. Among them was a young Comanche warrior, left alone, broken, and struggling for survival. He had been caught in the relentless blizzard while on a solitary hunt. Now, hours later, his body lay cold and trembling against the icy ground, too weak to continue. His breath came in ragged gasps as the coldness began to seep into his bones. He had no strength left to fight the elements. And yet, something kept him alive, perhaps a last sliver of hope that someone would find him before the storm claimed him completely. Meanwhile, several miles away, Abigail Hawthorne, a widow who had settled in the frontier after the loss of her husband and children, was making her way through the same storm. She was used to the harshness of the land, but tonight was different. The storm had worsened, and the path she usually took to the nearby town seemed more treacherous than ever. As she trudged through the deep snow, her thoughts were filled with memories of her lost family. She had lost her husband and children to the fever years ago, and now she lived alone on her small homestead by the Brazos River. Still, despite the pain and solitude, she pressed on. That night, however, fate had other plans for her. As the storm intensified, Abigail noticed something. A figure barely visible in the snow, crumpled against a large rock. Her heart skipped a beat as she rushed toward it, fear and uncertainty filling her every step. Could it be someone who needed help? The closer she got, the more she realized the shape before her was not just any stranger. It was a young Comanche warrior, his face frozen in a grimace of pain. His body was covered in wounds, and the blood that had seeped from his injuries had frozen into the snow around him. Without hesitation, Abigail knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she checked his pulse. It was faint but still there. She had no time to waste. The storm raged on, and she had no idea how long this man had been out here in the freezing cold. With all the strength she could muster, she lifted him into her arms, determined not to let this man die alone in the wilderness. As she carried him back to her cabin, memories of a time long ago flooded her mind. Memories of a Comanche warrior who had once saved her life during a terrible blizzard, guiding her to safety when she had been lost in the storm. At that moment, she realized who this man was. It was the same warrior who had once carried her through a blizzard, saving her when she had thought all hope was lost. She had never expected to see him again, but here he was, broken and helpless in her arms. She could hardly believe it. As she reached the warmth of her cabin, she carefully laid him on her bed, covering him with blankets to keep him warm. She could not help but wonder, had he been the one to save her, or was it fate that had brought them together once more? The questions swirled in her mind as she worked tirelessly to tend to his wounds, determined to keep him alive, just as he had once done for her. But as the hours passed, a new fear began to rise within her. Could she trust him again? Would he remember the promise he had made to protect her all those years ago? Or would this encounter prove to be another test of survival in the harsh frontier? As Abigail sat beside the fire, the warmth of the flames flickering softly across her face, she couldn't shake the images of the young Comanche warrior lying unconscious in her bed. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, a sign that he was still alive, though barely. His body was covered in cuts and bruises, wounds she could only assume came from his last struggle to survive the storm. Abigail's hands trembled as she gently cleaned the bloodstains from his skin, her thoughts swirling around the strange twist of fate that had brought him back into her life. The warrior she had once thought of only in passing memories, a figure who had saved her life in a time when she had lost everything, was now in need of her help. She felt conflicted, grateful for his past kindness, yet unsure of the danger his presence could bring. Was this truly the man who had helped her all those years ago? Or was he now an enemy, a part of the very tribe that had once terrorized the settlers? Abigail could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her. As she worked to tend to his wounds, she couldn't help but wonder if he would remember her. Would he recall the day he had pulled her from the blizzard, leading her to safety when all hope seemed lost? Or had time and hardship erased the bond they once shared? Abigail's mind raced as she gently placed a damp cloth on his forehead. She had to know. She had to understand the man who had once been her savior. Hours passed, and as the moon rose high in the sky, the Comanche warrior stirred, his eyes flickering open. For a moment, he simply stared at her, confusion clouding his expression. Then, as though recognizing something familiar in her face, his gaze softened. You saved me," he whispered, his voice hoarse and weak. Abigail's heart skipped a beat. She leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you remember me?" The warrior's eyes closed for a moment, and when they reopened, there was something in them, a recognition, a spark of memory. "The storm, the blizzard," he murmured, his words slow and deliberate. "You were lost. I carried you through the snow." Abigail's breath caught in her throat. The memory of that day, buried deep within her, suddenly came rushing back. She had been lost, alone in the wilderness, with no one to guide her. And then, out of nowhere, he had appeared, a lone Comanche warrior, his face stern but determined, carrying her through the freezing cold to safety. "I remember," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You carried me through the blizzard." The warrior nodded slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. "I owe you my life," he said, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. Abigail felt a rush of emotions overwhelm her. She had never expected this man to return to her life, let alone in such a vulnerable state. The warrior, whose tribe had been her greatest fear, was now the very person she had the chance to save. "You don't owe me anything," she replied, her voice steady. "But I will help you, just as you helped me." The warrior's gaze softened further, and he seemed to relax slightly under her touch. "I will never forget what you did for me," he said quietly, his words heavy with meaning. Abigail stood and moved toward the small cabinet in her cabin, gathering more supplies to tend to his wounds. As she did, she found herself thinking back to the day he had saved her. She had been a young woman, alone in the world, with nothing left to hold on to. And then he had appeared, like a guardian angel, guiding her through the storm and offering her a chance at survival. Now, the tables had turned. She was the one offering help, offering him a chance to live. Abigail couldn't help but wonder what this meant for their future. Would he remain a stranger, a warrior from a distant tribe, or would the bond between them grow stronger as time passed? She didn't know, but one thing was certain. This encounter had changed both of their lives forever. The warrior had been brought back to her, and with him, a chance at redemption, for both of them. As she returned to his side, her thoughts were interrupted by the warrior's voice. "What is your name?" he asked softly. "Abigail," she replied, offering him a warm smile. "Abigail Hawthorne." The warrior nodded, his lips curling into a faint smile of his own. "Thank you, Abigail," he said simply, his voice filled with sincerity. "I will not forget this." And in that moment, Abigail knew that her life, and his, were now forever intertwined. No longer just a woman lost in the wilderness, and no longer just a warrior from a distant tribe, but two souls connected by fate, two people who had saved each other in different ways. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Abigail couldn't help but feel that, despite the uncertainty of the world around them, this was the beginning of something new, a bond that would see them through the challenges of the harsh frontier. As the days passed, the storm that had once raged across the plains began to settle, leaving behind a quiet, heavy stillness in its wake. Abigail's small cabin, nestled against the wild landscape, had become a sanctuary, not just for her, but now for a man whose fate seemed forever tied to hers. The Comanche warrior, once an unfamiliar face, had become a presence in her life she could no longer ignore. He had regained strength quickly under her care, but Abigail noticed something else, a change in the air between them. The bond they had forged in the snow that fateful night had only deepened in the days that followed. Though neither of them spoke it aloud, the memory of the blizzard seemed to hang between them like an unspoken promise. The warrior, who had once been a distant figure, now seemed more like a man she could rely on, someone who had seen her at her lowest and had offered his protection. And now, In her quiet little cabin, she was doing the same for him. Each day, as he recovered, he would sit by the fire, sharpening his weapons or meditating in silence. Occasionally, Abigail would catch glimpses of the warrior's past in his eyes, a past full of conflict and loss, a past that no longer seemed so distant. She knew the Comanche tribe had been forced to live on the edge of survival, caught between their heritage and the ever-encroaching settlers. But now, she saw something else in him, a man who had fought, not for glory, but for the survival of his people. The warrior had become something more than just a man in need of rescue. He had become a symbol of the strength and resilience of his tribe. Yet despite his strength, there was still something vulnerable in him. One evening, as Abigail sat beside him, preparing a meal from the last of her provisions, she looked at him. "You were there, in the storm," she said quietly, breaking the silence. "You carried me through it." The warrior's eyes flickered toward her, as if the memory had come rushing back to him. "I did not want you to die," he said simply, his voice soft but firm. "The storm takes no pity." Abigail nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She understood. He had risked his life to save her from a death in the cold, a fate that had nearly claimed her. And now, in return, she had done the same for him. But as much as they had saved each other, there was still a chasm between them, an unspoken tension that neither of them seemed able to bridge. The Comanche warrior had not yet spoken of his past, of his tribe, or the reason he had been wandering the wilderness alone. It was clear to Abigail that his journey was far from over. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that their paths were more intertwined than either of them had imagined. The warrior, whose name she still didn't know, had saved her life, and now she had saved his. But what came next? As the days turned into weeks, Abigail began to notice the signs of something changing in her. The isolation that had once felt like a weight on her shoulders now seemed to ease, replaced by the comforting presence of the man in her cabin. But she also noticed something else, an unease that lingered in the back of her mind. She could not ignore the growing sense that her home, her quiet life, was no longer her own. The warrior was a reminder of the life she had left behind, the life of a widow, a woman who had once lived with a husband and children. The thought of that life now felt like a distant memory. And yet, as the warrior's presence grew stronger, so too did her own feelings. She knew what it meant to live with loss, to carry the weight of what had once been, but now, the weight seemed less heavy. For the first time since her family's death, she felt a flicker of something else, something that had been buried deep inside her for years. A longing, a desire for something more. As the days passed, Abigail could no longer deny it. She had come to depend on the warrior, and he, too, had come to depend on her. But there was still the question that hung over them both. What would happen next? Would the bond they had shared in the storm lead to something more, or would they remain strangers bound by circumstance? It was a question Abigail couldn't answer, but as she looked into his eyes, she knew that whatever came next, she would face it alongside him. Together, they had survived the storm. And now, together, they would face whatever challenges the future held. As the days wore on, the bond between Abigail and the Comanche warrior grew stronger. She had learned his name, Takakota, and in return, he had come to trust her in ways that he had never trusted anyone before. They shared quiet meals by the fire, sometimes in silence, sometimes exchanging stories of their pasts. He told her of his life in the tribe, of the hardships they had endured, and the battles fought against the encroaching settlers. Though the pain of his past was clear in his eyes, he spoke with a quiet dignity, as if the weight of his people's history was something he had learned to carry without bitterness. Abigail listened intently, feeling a mixture of sorrow and awe. She had once feared the Comanche, as many of the settlers did. But now, sitting across from him, she saw the man behind the warrior, a man shaped by the same forces of survival and loss that had defined her own life. The quiet companionship between them had begun to fill the emptiness in Abigail's heart. She had spent so long living in the shadow of grief, but now she found herself looking forward to the future, to the possibilities that seemed to grow with each passing day. Still, there was a tension that neither of them spoke of, a quiet understanding that neither of them truly belonged to the other's world. Takakota, despite his healing, still bore the weight of his past, and Abigail knew that he could not stay with her forever. He had responsibilities to his people, and she could not offer him a life free from the struggles of the frontier. Yet, in the quiet moments when their eyes met, there was an unspoken connection, a bond that neither the past nor the future could break. One evening, as the sun began to set and the golden light of the day faded into the cool blues of twilight, Takakota stood by the cabin, his hand resting lightly on his bow. He had been spending more time outside, preparing for the inevitable day when he would need to leave. Abigail watched him from the door, sensing the change in the air. She knew he was thinking about the future, about the duty he had to his tribe. "You're leaving, aren't you?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Takakota turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I have to," he said quietly. "My people, they need me." There was a long pause between them, one that seemed to stretch endlessly. Abigail nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. She had known this day would come, but now that it was here, the reality of it seemed to sting more than she had expected. "I understand," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I'll miss you." Takakota stepped toward her, his eyes searching hers, and for a moment, the harshness of the world outside seemed to fade. "I will miss you too, Abigail," he said, his voice low and sincere. "You saved my life, and I will never forget that." His words held a weight of gratitude, but also something deeper, something that neither of them could fully articulate. Abigail stepped closer to him, her heart racing. She knew what was at stake. She knew that their worlds were too different, that they could never truly belong to each other. But in that moment, standing on the threshold of her cabin, the future seemed distant, a problem for another time. Takakota reached out and took her hand in his grip strong but gentle. The touch was simple, yet it spoke volumes. They didn't need to say anything more. They both knew what was happening, what was inevitable. Abigail closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath as the wind carried the scent of the earth and the distant mountains. It was a quiet, sacred moment, one that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. They were two souls, brought together by fate, bound by a shared history of survival, and now, facing the uncertain future together. As the last light of the day faded into night, Takakota gently pulled her closer, and without a word, they shared a moment of peace. In that brief embrace, there was no past, no future, only the present, a fleeting connection that neither of them would forget. The storm had brought them together once before, and now, in the stillness of the night, it seemed that it had brought them together once more. And though the future was uncertain, Abigail knew that for this moment, they were exactly where they needed to be. As the days went by, the inevitable tension between Abigail and Takakota began to grow. The bond they had shared, born of necessity and deep gratitude, was now tangled with emotions neither of them could fully express. Takakota had stayed by her side, healing from his wounds and training in the silence of the wilderness. But despite his healing, there was something restless in him, a yearning to return to his people, to his tribe. Abigail could sense it every time he stood at the edge of the cabin, his gaze drifting toward the distant mountains, where his people roamed. It was as though the land itself called to him, whispering the need for him to return. Abigail, however, was torn. She had come to depend on his presence, the quiet companionship that had slowly filled the empty spaces in her heart. But she knew she could not keep him here forever. His destiny lay beyond her small homestead, beyond the safety of the cabin and the warmth they had found together. One evening, as the sun set low behind the mountains, Takakota stood in the doorway, his figure silhouetted against the fading light. Abigail watched him, her hands resting in her lap as she sat by the fire. She had come to terms with the fact that his departure was inevitable, but that did not make the thought of losing him any easier. "You are leaving, aren't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Takakota turned toward her, his eyes soft, yet filled with the weight of the decision he had already made. "Yes," he said simply. "I have to go back to my people. The storm has passed, and my tribe needs me." His words were gentle, but they carried the weight of a life lived on the edge of survival. Abigail nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. "I understand," she replied, her voice steady despite the rush of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I knew this day would come." Takakota stepped closer to her, his strong presence filling the space between them. He knelt before her, his eyes locking with hers. "You saved my life, Abigail," he said, his voice low and sincere. "And I will never forget what you did for me. You gave me a chance to live, and I will carry that with me always." Abigail reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she touched his arm. "And I will never forget you," she whispered. "You have been my protector, my strength, and I will always carry the memory of what we shared." For a moment, they simply sat in silence, the fire crackling softly between them. The weight of their shared history hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Then, Takakota stood, his posture firm but calm. "I must go now," he said, his voice steady, yet filled with sadness. "But I will not forget you. And perhaps, one day, our paths will cross again." Abigail stood as well, her heart heavy but resolute. She walked with him to the door, her steps slow and measured. When they reached the threshold, she paused and looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. "Take care of yourself, Takakota," she said softly. "May the spirits guide you home." He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "And may they watch over you as well, Abigail." With that, he stepped out into the cold night, disappearing into the darkness of the wilderness. Abigail stood there for a moment, her heart aching as she watched him go. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and earth, and for a fleeting moment, Abigail felt a deep connection to the land itself. A connection that transcended boundaries, transcended the differences that had once seemed so vast. She knew that the future was uncertain, that her life would never be the same without Takakota by her side. But in that moment, she also knew that she had given him the freedom to follow his own path. And though their time together had been brief, it had been meaningful. As the night grew colder, Abigail turned back to her cabin, the door closing softly behind her. She would continue on, as she always had, but a part of her would always remain out there, in the wilderness, with Takakota, the warrior who had saved her once and whose memory would never fade. The days that followed Takakota's departure were long, filled with a quiet stillness that hung over Abigail like a weight. The wind howled through the trees outside her cabin, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and the distant echoes of a life that felt both familiar and foreign. It had been weeks since he had left, but the memory of his presence lingered, like a shadow that refused to fade. Abigail had grown used to the loneliness that came with life on the frontier, but this felt different. She missed the silence he brought, the unspoken understanding that passed between them with every glance and every shared moment. But as the days turned into weeks, the loneliness began to settle into something deeper, something more profound. She tried to keep herself busy, tending to her garden, repairing the fences around her land, and preparing for the coming winter. But even the work of the land couldn't fill the emptiness in her heart. Every task she completed felt like a hollow victory. Every day that passed without Takakota felt like a reminder of how much he had meant to her. Yet, despite the emptiness, Abigail could not ignore the part of her that understood why he had to leave. His duty to his people, his tribe, was something that could not be ignored. The land called to him, as it had called to so many before him. And in that call, Abigail knew that there was nothing she could do to change the course of his path. As the nights grew colder, Abigail spent more time by the fire, staring into the flames as her thoughts wandered to Takakota. She wondered where he was, what he was doing, and whether he thought of her as she thought of him. Did he miss her, or was he already lost to his tribe once more? The uncertainty weighed heavily on her mind, keeping her awake long into the night. It was during one of these sleepless nights that she heard it, the sound of horses' hooves in the distance, steady and rhythmic against the quiet of the land. Abigail's heart skipped a beat. She stood, her breath catching in her throat as she strained to listen. It wasn't long before she saw them, the dark silhouettes of riders against the dimming sky, moving slowly toward her cabin. Her heart raced as she stepped outside, her hand instinctively reaching for the rifle she kept by the door. She had seen enough to know that visitors to her cabin were never entirely predictable. As the riders drew closer, Abigail's breath caught in her chest. There, at the head of the group, was Takakota. His figure was unmistakable against the twilight sky, the long shadows of his people stretching behind him. Her heart fluttered as she stepped forward, unsure of what this visit meant. Was he back for good? Or was this merely a passing moment? A chance encounter in the vast wilderness? Takakota dismounted his horse and walked toward her, his eyes soft but serious. His people followed behind him, waiting quietly as he approached. Abigail stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to act, her emotions rising in a tide she couldn't control. "Takakota," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You came back." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I had to," he said, his voice low and steady. "My tribe, there is a time for everything. And the time for my return was now." He gestured to the group behind him, and Abigail noticed the small band of Comanche warriors who had accompanied him. They were silent, their presence both reassuring and intimidating. "These are my people," Takakota continued, his eyes meeting hers. "They have come to see that I returned safely and to ask for your help." Abigail's confusion deepened. "My help?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Takakota nodded. "There are many things that have changed in the time I have been away. My people are scattered, and we are in need of allies. Your land, Abigail, it has something that we need, something that could change everything for my tribe." His words were cryptic, but Abigail could sense the gravity behind them. She felt the weight of the moment settling around her, as if everything she had known up until now was shifting, and the future was about to unfold in ways she could not predict. "What do you need from me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. Takakota's gaze softened, and for the first time since his return, she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "I need your help to unite the people of my tribe," he said. "There is a land, a place where we can rebuild, where we can find peace. But we cannot do it alone. We need others to join us, to help us heal the wounds of the past." Abigail looked at him, her heart torn between the life she had made and the man who had once saved her. She understood what he was asking, but she also understood the cost of such a decision. It would mean more than just helping a man. It would mean choosing sides in a conflict that stretched beyond her own small corner of the world. It would mean becoming part of something much larger than herself. And yet, as she looked into Takakota's eyes, she knew what her answer would be. She had always known. "I will help you," she said softly, her voice firm with resolve. "But we will need to be careful. The world outside these mountains is not kind to those who are different. If we are to help, we must do so in a way that protects us all." Takakota nodded, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. "I knew you would understand," he said. As the group gathered around her, Abigail felt the weight of her decision settling in her bones. This was no longer just a choice between two people. It was a choice that would shape the future of her life, her land, and the lives of those she had come to care for. It was a decision that would change everything. And as she looked at the warriors around her, she knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The next morning, Abigail stood outside her cabin, watching as Takakota and his warriors prepared to leave. The air was thick with tension, the weight of their decision hanging over them all. She could feel the cold of the coming winter creeping through the trees, but it was the coldness of uncertainty that truly chilled her. Takakota had returned to her not just as a man in need of help, but as a leader, someone who could shape the future of his people. And now, that future rested on her shoulders as much as his. Abigail had made her decision. She would help him, but the cost of that help was greater than she had anticipated. As the warriors mounted their horses, preparing to head toward the disputed land where Takakota believed his people could rebuild, Abigail felt a sense of unease stir within her. She had no idea what lay ahead, or how she would explain this decision to her neighbors, who had always viewed her with suspicion. The settlers didn't trust the Comanche, and they certainly didn't trust the idea of one of them seeking help from a white woman. But she had come to realize that this was not just about loyalty to her new ally. It was about something deeper, something tied to the very land she had worked so hard to tame. Takakota approached her, his face solemn but determined. He had shed his warrior's armor, now wearing the simple clothes of a man on a mission. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, they stood in silence, the air between them charged with the weight of unspoken words. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice quiet, the hint of concern not lost on her. Abigail met his gaze and nodded. "I'm sure," she replied, her voice steady. She knew that there was no turning back now. This wasn't just about helping one man. It was about standing by the truth she had come to understand. "Then let's go," Takakota said, his voice firm with resolve. They set out together, Abigail riding behind him on her own horse, the journey ahead of them long and uncertain. As they traveled, Abigail found herself caught between two worlds. The land she had come to know and love was now the very land that stood between Takakota and his people's future. The further they traveled, the more isolated they became. The dense forest gave way to open plains, and Abigail felt herself shrinking beneath the vastness of it all. But Takakota remained focused, his determination never wavering. She had come to understand that this man, this warrior, carried the weight of more than just his own survival. He carried the survival of his people, the legacy of those who had fought for their freedom against all odds. His strength was not just in his ability to fight. It was in his capacity to endure, to never give up on the things that mattered most to him. And now, Abigail was part of that fight. The journey took them deeper into unfamiliar territory, past barren hills and through dense brush. As they reached the base of a mountain, Takakota stopped, his keen eyes scanning the horizon. "This is where we make our stand," he said, his voice calm but resolute. Abigail looked around, taking in the rugged terrain, the high cliffs, and the winding paths that led up the mountain. It was a place that seemed to offer both protection and challenge, a place that could be both a sanctuary and a battleground. It was here, in this wild expanse, that Takakota hoped to rebuild his people's future. But Abigail knew that it wouldn't be easy. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice a mixture of curiosity and concern. Takakota looked back at her, his eyes dark with the weight of the decision. "Now we wait," he replied. "Now we wait for the others to come. We wait for those who are willing to fight for what is ours." Abigail nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. As she sat by the fire that night, watching the stars overhead, she thought about the journey that had led her here, about the loss, the grief, and the bond she had shared with Takakota. She had come to this land as a widow, broken by the past. But now, she found herself standing on the edge of something new, something uncertain. The world around her was changing, and with it, so was she. The next few days passed in quiet preparation. Takakota's warriors spread out, scouting the land, marking their boundaries, and preparing for what was to come. Abigail helped where she could, offering what little support she had, but she knew she could not do this alone. She could not fight the world on her own. She needed the strength of the warriors, the resolve of Takakota, and the hope that perhaps, together, they could make a difference. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in the air grew thicker. Abigail found herself growing restless, her thoughts often turning to the people she had left behind. Her neighbors, the settlers, who had always viewed her with a wary eye. Would they understand? Would they see what she had come to see? That this was not just about survival, but about standing up for what was right? Takakota had promised her that he would protect her, that he would never forget the kindness she had shown him. But Abigail knew that the future was never certain. As much as she wanted to believe in his words, she knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with danger. Yet, despite the uncertainty, Abigail felt a sense of peace settle within her. She had made her choice, and for the first time in a long while, she felt that she was exactly where she was meant to be. As the days stretched on, the air around the makeshift camp grew heavy with anticipation. Abigail had grown accustomed to the daily rhythm of life with Takakota and his warriors. The men were busy, constantly preparing, training, and maintaining their vigilance in the rugged terrain that had become their new home. Yet, beneath the calm exterior, the tension was palpable. Everyone knew the next steps were crucial. The silence of the wilderness was often broken by the rhythmic pounding of hammer on stone or the soft murmur of conversation among the warriors. But it was the quiet moments, when the fires burned low and the stars stretched out across the sky, that brought the most introspection. Abigail spent her evenings by the fire, thinking about everything that had led her to this moment. Her decision to help Takakota and his people had been made with conviction, but she could not help but wonder what it would cost. The settlers were not likely to look kindly on her alliance with the Comanche, and the tension between the tribes and the settlers was already high. What would the consequences be for her land? But then, she thought of Takakota and his people, the strength and honor they carried despite the hardships they had faced. She thought of his quiet determination and the unspoken bond that had formed between them. She had saved him once, and now she would stand beside him as he had stood beside her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Takakota approached her by the fire. He looked different now, stronger, more at ease in his leadership role. Yet there was something in his eyes that made Abigail pause. Something unspoken, something that weighed heavy on his shoulders. "Abigail," he began, his voice low but steady. "There are things that are not yet settled. We are not the only ones who see the value in this land." She raised an eyebrow, sensing where this conversation was going. "You mean the settlers?" she asked, her voice steady. Takakota nodded, his expression grave. "They will not welcome us. They see us as threats, as invaders. We must be ready for the challenges they will bring." Abigail exhaled slowly, processing his words. She had expected as much. The settlers were never going to accept the Comanche reclaiming their land. But there was something in Takakota's tone, something that made her understand the depth of the struggle ahead. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. Takakota's eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was a vulnerability in his gaze. "You know this land better than any of us," he said softly. "You understand the ways of the settlers. I need you to help us navigate this world, to help us protect what we have." Abigail's heart pounded in her chest. She had made her decision to help, but now the stakes felt much higher. She could no longer ignore the reality of what was happening. The settlers would come, and they would not come with kindness. The very land she had once fought to protect now stood between her and the people she had promised to help. "I'll do what I can," she said, her voice resolute. "But we need more than just knowledge of the land. We need allies. We can't face this alone." Takakota looked at her with something akin to respect in his eyes. "We are not alone, Abigail. We will find those who will stand with us." And so, they began their preparations. Takakota and his warriors worked tirelessly, training for what was to come. Abigail, on the other hand, focused on the settlers. She began to make her way to the nearby town, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the very people she had once called neighbors were now potentially her enemies. As she rode into the town, she felt the familiar stares of suspicion and curiosity. The settlers hadn't forgotten who she was, but now, she wasn't just Abigail Hawthorne, the widow who had lived alone in the wilderness. She was the woman who had allied herself with the Comanche. She could feel their eyes on her, and it made her stomach churn. Still, she pressed on. She had to know where they stood, what they were planning. She needed to prepare, to understand how far she was willing to go to protect Takakota and his people. As she entered the town, she spotted a familiar face, John Prescott, a former neighbor and friend of her late husband. He was standing outside the saloon, his face weathered by the harshness of life on the frontier. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Abigail wasn't sure what to do. But then, John stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Abigail," he said softly, his voice low. "I heard about what you've done, helping them. The Comanche." His words weren't accusatory, but there was a weight to them, a heaviness that she hadn't expected. "I'm not here to fight," Abigail said, her voice steady. "I'm here to understand. I need to know what the settlers are planning." John's gaze softened, and he looked around to make sure no one was listening. "They're not planning anything good," he said quietly. "They don't trust them. They never will. You've made your choice, Abigail. But I'm afraid you've made an enemy of more than just the Comanche." His words hung in the air, and Abigail knew they were the truth. The settlers would never accept the Comanche, and now, neither would they accept her. She had chosen a side, and there would be no turning back. The battle was coming, and Abigail had to decide just how far she was willing to go to protect the people she had come to care for. As the days wore on, Abigail found herself at the heart of an escalating tension she had not fully anticipated. The settlers, who had once been mere neighbors, now viewed her with suspicion and mistrust. Her decision to stand by Takakota, to support his people, had made her an outcast in a community that had once been her home. Despite her resolve to do what was right, the weight of her choices grew heavier with each passing day. Takakota and his warriors had set up a temporary camp in the hills beyond her homestead, carefully preparing for the confrontation they all knew was inevitable. Abigail had visited him several times, bringing him provisions and updates from the town, but each trip left her feeling more isolated, more distant from the life she had once known. She spent her nights restless, her mind constantly turning over the conversations she had overheard in town. The whispers of rebellion, the rising fear that the Comanche would overrun the settlement, the calls for action from the more vocal members of the community. She couldn't help but feel the weight of the impending conflict. Every step she took was now a step toward an uncertain future. The time for diplomacy was over. The settlers were preparing for war, and she could no longer hide in the shadows of neutrality. Her alliance with Takakota had sealed her fate. One evening, as the last light of the sun bled into the horizon, Abigail found herself standing by the window, staring out at the darkening landscape. She could hear the distant sounds of horses' hooves and the clink of armor as Takakota's warriors moved through the woods, readying themselves for what lay ahead. The crackle of the fire in the hearth was the only sound inside the cabin, and for a moment, Abigail let herself simply listen, to feel the weight of the quiet before the storm. Takakota's words echoed in her mind. "We are not alone, Abigail. We will find those who will stand with us." It was a promise he had made, but in the solitude of her cabin, Abigail wondered if it was enough. The settlers were united in their fear and distrust of the Comanche, and that fear was beginning to spill over into hatred. Abigail knew that her people, her neighbors, were not the type to forgive easily, and the idea of working together, of finding common ground, seemed increasingly impossible. The silence was broken by a knock at the door. Abigail's heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting this. When she opened it, she found John Prescott standing there, his face grave. He didn't look like the man she had known, the once friendly neighbor whose presence she had once welcomed. Now, there was a hardness to his features, a determination that made her stomach tighten. "Abigail," he said, his voice low, "I need to talk to you." "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "What's going on, John?" "You need to make a choice," he said, stepping into the cabin. "You've made it clear whose side you're on, but this thing, it's bigger than you, bigger than all of us." He paused, glancing around the room as if the walls themselves might be listening. "People are scared, Abigail. They're angry, and they're organizing. We can't let them walk all over us." Abigail's pulse quickened, her mind racing. She had known that something like this would come, but hearing it from John, someone she had once trusted, made it feel all the more real. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm saying that the settlers are ready to fight. There's a meeting tomorrow morning at the town hall. They're going to make their move, and you'll have to choose a side." John's eyes were dark, his expression resolute. "If you stand with him," he nodded toward the direction of Takakota's camp, "you'll be standing against all of us." Abigail's mind swirled, but she kept her voice calm. "I've already chosen." John stared at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words, before he nodded slowly. "Then I guess we'll see what happens," he muttered, turning toward the door. As he stepped out into the night, Abigail felt a coldness settle deep in her chest. She knew that the time for quiet decisions had passed. The line had been drawn, and there would be no crossing back over it. The next morning, she rode out to Takakota's camp, her mind still reeling from John's words. She couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. She had no illusions about the difficulty of the path ahead, but as she approached the camp, she saw Takakota standing tall, his warriors gathered around him. The atmosphere was tense, but there was a sense of purpose in the air, a quiet understanding that they had reached the point of no return. Takakota looked up as she approached, his eyes softening when they met hers. "You've come," he said, his voice steady but with a touch of uncertainty. "I know what you're up against," Abigail replied, her voice thick with emotion. "But I can't back down now." Takakota nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Neither can we." The realization hit Abigail like a blow to the chest. She had chosen her side, and there was no turning back. The settlers had their fear, and the Comanche had their resolve. But what neither side had was the truth of what could be built, what could be fought for, if they could only come together. But that was a dream Abigail knew could never be realized. Not now, not in this world. The war was coming, and Abigail was at the heart of it. She could feel the winds of change sweeping through the land, and there was no escaping the storm that was about to break. As the sun rose the next morning, Abigail could feel the weight of the decision she had made pressing down on her. She had chosen a side, and there would be no turning back now. The town meeting was set to take place that day, and she knew the settlers would be gathering, preparing for what they believed was an inevitable conflict. Takakota's warriors had fortified their camp, waiting for the settlers' next move, but the uncertainty in the air was almost palpable. Abigail spent the morning preparing herself mentally, her thoughts heavy with the reality of the situation. She knew that no matter what happened at the meeting, things were about to change forever. The world she had once known, the world she had fought so hard to carve out a place in, was now slipping away from her, piece by piece. As she rode toward the town hall, the familiar sights of the settlement seemed alien to her. The faces of the settlers that she had once greeted warmly now appeared hardened, their eyes filled with mistrust and fear. The atmosphere in the town was tense, and Abigail could feel the weight of their judgment with every step she took. She had been a part of this community once, but now, it seemed as though she was an outsider, someone who had betrayed them. She made her way to the meeting, where the settlers had already gathered in the town hall, their murmurs and heated discussions filling the air. John Prescott was there, his face grim as he stood near the front of the room, speaking with a group of men. When he saw Abigail enter, his gaze hardened, but he said nothing. It was clear that the divide between them was now complete. The room fell silent as Abigail made her way to the front, her heart racing. She had never felt more out of place, more uncertain of her place in the world. Takakota's words echoed in her mind. "We are not alone, Abigail. We will find those who will stand with us." But she wasn't sure if she could stand against the people she had once called family. The town sheriff, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Cooper, stepped forward, his voice commanding as he addressed the room. "We've heard enough," he said, his tone sharp. "The Comanche have been seen in the hills. They've been gathering, and they're not just out there for the hunting." His eyes swept the room, meeting Abigail's gaze for a brief moment before moving on. "We need to act. We need to protect what's ours." Abigail could feel the tension in the room rise as the settlers murmured their agreement. She could see the fear in their eyes, the desperation that had taken root in their hearts. They were ready for a fight, and they believed they were in the right. But she knew better. The settlers were not the only ones who had lost their homes, their families. The Comanche had lost everything too. Takakota and his people had been driven to the edges of the land, forced to live in the shadows of a world that had no place for them. And now, the settlers were coming for them, just as they had come for the native people before them. She took a deep breath, stepping forward into the center of the room, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "You don't understand," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "The Comanche are not our enemies. They are people, just like us. They have lost everything, just like we have." The room fell silent, the settlers staring at her as if she had spoken a foreign language. John Prescott's face was twisted in disbelief, and he stepped forward, his voice low but filled with anger. "You've gone mad, Abigail. You're siding with them? After everything they've done." His words were sharp, cutting through the room like a knife. Abigail's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood her ground. "I'm not siding with anyone," she said, her voice firm. "I'm standing up for what's right." She turned to face the room, meeting the eyes of the settlers one by one. "We don't have to fight. We don't have to destroy each other. We can find a way to live together, to share this land." The room was silent, but Abigail could feel the weight of their stares pressing down on her. She had no illusions about what she was asking. She wasn't just asking them to listen to her. She was asking them to change, to let go of their fear and hatred and see the humanity in the people they saw as their enemies. It was a hope that seemed impossible, but it was a hope she couldn't let go of. Takakota's warriors would never survive another battle with the settlers. She knew that, and the settlers would lose everything they had fought for if they didn't find a way to stop the cycle of violence that had been going on for generations. As the room remained still, Abigail could see the shift in the faces around her. Some of the settlers were beginning to waver, their anger giving way to uncertainty. But others, like John, were resolute in their belief that war was the only answer. "You're making a mistake," John said, his voice low and threatening. "This is not your fight." Abigail turned to him, her heart aching with the weight of his words. "This is everyone's fight," she said softly, her voice filled with resolve. "And if we don't stand together, we will all lose." The sheriff stepped forward, his face hard and determined. "Enough of this," he said, his voice ringing out across the room. "We'll do what we must to protect this land. And if Abigail chooses to stand with them, then she'll have to face the consequences." His words hung in the air, and Abigail knew that the decision had been made. The settlers had drawn their line in the sand, and there was no going back. As the meeting ended, Abigail left the hall, her heart heavy with the knowledge that war was coming, and there was no escaping it. She had chosen her side, but she couldn't shake the feeling that both sides were doomed to lose in the end. The days following the meeting passed in a blur of uncertainty. Abigail felt the weight of her decision settle deeper into her bones with every passing hour. The settlers had made their intentions clear, and the truth of the situation hit harder than any battle. The town was divided. The settlers who had once welcomed her, who had once seen her as one of their own, now viewed her with suspicion and anger. She had chosen to stand with Takakota and the Comanche, and in doing so, she had sealed her fate. Takakota and his warriors remained encamped in the hills, waiting for whatever came next. Their presence was a silent reminder of what was at stake, and every time Abigail looked toward the hills, her heart tightened. She had no illusions about the violence that could come, but she also couldn't ignore the possibility of peace, even if it seemed impossible. Her role was no longer just that of an ally. She had become a bridge between two worlds, two cultures that had been at war for far too long. And yet, the reality of her situation felt more like a dream that was slipping through her fingers the longer she stayed in the town. As the settlers gathered their weapons, preparing for the worst, Abigail knew she had little time to make a difference. Every decision she made now would matter. That night, she sat alone by the fire in her cabin, the flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. She thought about the family she had lost, the life she had once had, and how everything had changed in the blink of an eye. Takakota had been her savior, and now, in return, she had to save him. She had to save his people, not just from the settlers, but from the cycle of violence that seemed to perpetuate itself. She could no longer wait for peace to come. She had to find a way to make it happen. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. Startled, she stood up quickly, her hand instinctively reaching for the rifle by the door. But when she opened it, she found herself face to face with John Prescott. His face was drawn, his eyes tired but resolute. "Abigail," he said quietly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "There's no more time for talking. The settlers are ready. They're preparing to move against the Comanche. You need to come with me." Abigail felt her heart race as the door closed behind him. "What do you mean, ready?" she asked, her voice shaking. "They're not just going to wait around. They're coming for them tonight. And you." He paused, looking at her as though he were weighing her very soul. "You have to make a choice. You can't keep playing both sides. You're with us, or you're with them. You can't keep standing in the middle." Abigail's chest tightened. She had already made her choice, but hearing John's words made it all the more real. "I've already chosen," she said firmly. "And if you're here to make me change my mind, you're wasting your time." John sighed, a look of disappointment crossing his face. "You think it's that simple, don't you?" he asked, his voice low and full of bitterness. "You're not the only one with a family to protect. You think I want to fight? You think I want to see blood spilled? But this is the world we live in now. And you." He stopped himself, his anger seeping away as quickly as it had come. "You were one of us. You were a part of this town. And now you're turning your back on it. You've forgotten what we've all fought for." Abigail looked at him, her heart heavy. She understood his pain, his fear. But she also understood the bigger picture. She had seen too much to go back now. "I haven't forgotten anything," she said quietly. "But I can't stand by and watch this happen. I won't let you make the same mistakes." John stared at her, his eyes filled with conflicting emotions. He opened his mouth to say something, but seemed to think better of it. Instead, he turned away, his shoulders slumping as he walked out the door. "Then you're on your own, Abigail," he muttered over his shoulder. "We all are." As he left, Abigail stood frozen in the doorway, the weight of his words settling over her like a cloud. She had no illusions about what was coming. The settlers were ready to fight, and soon, Takakota and his warriors would be ready to defend themselves. But what she didn't know was how much time they had left before the world as she knew it would shatter. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. She had to act. She had to do something to stop this madness before it was too late. Abigail rode out to the hills where Takakota's warriors were gathered. The moonlight bathed the landscape in an eerie glow, casting long shadows across the rugged terrain. As she approached, she saw the campfires burning brightly in the distance, the figures of the warriors moving silently around them. Takakota stood at the center, his silhouette tall and commanding as he spoke with his men. When he saw Abigail, his eyes softened, and he walked toward her. "I've made my decision," she said, her voice steady but full of determination. "I can't let this go on. I'll do whatever it takes to stop it." Takakota nodded, his expression resolute. "We will stand together," he said simply. "And we will fight, not just for survival, but for the future of all our people." As Abigail joined him by the fire, she felt a sense of resolve settle in her heart. She had made her choice, and now there would be no turning back. The war was coming, and it would be fought on all fronts. But Abigail knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, she would face it with Takakota by her side. The tension in the air was palpable as Abigail stood in the dim light of the fire, her heart pounding in her chest. The warriors had gathered, Takakota at their head, preparing for the inevitable conflict with the settlers. Abigail had never imagined her life would lead her here, caught between two worlds, with the weight of survival pressing down on both sides. She had made the choice to stand with Takakota and his people, but the cost was becoming clearer with each passing moment. The settlers, led by John Prescott, were preparing for battle, their fear and anger fueling their resolve. The small, peaceful life Abigail had once known was slipping away, replaced by the harsh realities of a frontier at war. But as she looked at Takakota, standing tall and resolute, Abigail knew she couldn't turn back now. She had chosen this path, and she would walk it to the end. Takakota's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, they shared a silent understanding. The future was uncertain, the danger clear, but they were in this together. "Are you ready?" Takakota asked, his voice steady and calm despite the looming storm. Abigail nodded, her heart racing but her resolve firm. "I'm ready," she said, her voice strong. Takakota gave her a small nod, his expression softening just for a moment before he turned to address his warriors. The air was thick with anticipation as Takakota spoke, his words carrying the weight of leadership and the hope of a people who had been displaced for too long. "Tonight, we fight not just for our survival, but for the future of our people," he said. "We will stand together, and we will not be driven from this land again." His words were met with murmurs of agreement, the warriors standing straighter, their resolve hardening like steel. Abigail could see the fire in their eyes, the same fire that had burned in Takakota since the moment they had first met. She had learned so much from him, about strength, survival, and what it truly meant to fight for something greater than oneself. As the warriors prepared for battle, Abigail felt a pang of fear deep in her chest. This wasn't the life she had imagined for herself. She had never asked for any of this. But now, standing at the precipice of war, she realized that she was as much a part of this fight as the Comanche who stood beside her. The settlers would not understand, and perhaps they never would. But Abigail had come to understand something far more important, that peace, true peace, could only be built on the foundation of understanding and shared struggle. As the night drew on, the tension grew thicker. The warriors moved silently through the camp, preparing their weapons and making their final checks. Abigail stayed close to Takakota, her heart torn between the man she had come to care for and the people she had left behind. The settlers were not evil, they were simply driven by fear. But that fear had become a weapon, and fear, Abigail knew, could drive even the kindest heart to violence. She glanced over at Takakota, watching as he spoke with his second-in-command, giving final instructions for the battle ahead. His face was unreadable, his posture unwavering. But there was something in his eyes that told her he, too, was thinking of what was to come. He wasn't just fighting for his people, he was fighting for her too. For the life they had built, for the future they had hoped for, and for the chance to make a place for both their worlds in this wild, untamed land. "We will fight for what is right," Takakota said quietly, turning to face her. "And when this is over, no matter the outcome, we will build something together." Abigail felt her throat tighten at his words. It wasn't just a promise. It was a vision, one she had once thought impossible. Together, they could find a way. But first, they had to survive. The sound of hooves in the distance broke her from her thoughts. The settlers were coming. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, the heavy thrum of the earth beneath her feet, the unmistakable sense of something inevitable approaching. She stood, her hand resting on the rifle at her side, ready for whatever came next. Takakota's warriors were already positioned, their movements swift and deliberate. Abigail had spent enough time with them to know their tactics, their quiet discipline. They would fight with honor, as they always did. But would the settlers? Would they see this battle for what it truly was, an opportunity for peace? Or would they be blinded by fear and hatred? As the first riders of the settlers appeared on the horizon, Takakota stepped forward, his presence commanding. He didn't call for an attack, but the warriors were ready. Abigail stood beside him, her heart racing but her mind clear. This wasn't just a battle for land or power. This was a battle for the future, one that would determine whether they could coexist, whether peace was even possible. As the settlers drew closer, Abigail felt the weight of the moment settle over her like a shroud. This was it. There would be no more words, no more trying to convince anyone. This was the moment that would define everything that had come before and everything that would follow. Takakota met her gaze, his eyes soft but filled with determination. "Stay close," he said. "We face this together." And with that, they moved into position, ready to face whatever came next. The storm was coming, and all they could do was stand firm, side by side, and fight for the future they believed in. The night air was thick with tension, the sounds of hooves and distant voices cutting through the otherwise silent wilderness. Abigail stood alongside Takakota, her heart pounding as the final moments before the inevitable battle approached. The settlers were drawing nearer, their numbers clear even in the dim light of the moon. It was a sight that Abigail had never hoped to see. Her own people, armed and ready to defend what they thought was theirs. Takakota's warriors, though fewer in number, were just as determined, standing silently in their positions, prepared for whatever came next. The silence stretched, each second feeling like an eternity. Abigail's mind raced, her thoughts flitting between the life she had known and the one she was now a part of. She had never imagined herself in a situation like this, caught between two worlds, neither of which seemed willing to accept the other. Her heart ached for both sides, for the settlers who were only trying to protect their homes, and for the Comanche who had been driven to the brink of survival. As the first settlers broke through the trees and came into view, Abigail's breath caught in her throat. She could see John Prescott at the front of the group, his expression grim and set with determination. His eyes briefly locked with hers. And for a moment, there was no hatred in them, just the weariness of someone who had seen too much. "Abigail," he called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "This doesn't have to happen." The words hit Abigail like a punch to the gut. Could it be true? Was there a way to stop this madness before it spiraled into violence? She felt Takakota's presence beside her, his quiet strength giving her the courage she needed. She stepped forward, her heart in her throat, but she didn't hesitate. "John," she called back, her voice steady. "There is still a chance for peace. You know this isn't what we wanted." John shook his head, his face hardening. "It's too late for that, Abigail. They've crossed our land too many times. They've pushed us too far." He looked behind him, signaling to the settlers. "This is the end of it. We can't let them take any more." Abigail could hear the fear in his voice now, the same fear that had driven so many of the settlers to take up arms. But in his eyes, there was also something else, regret. Regret for what was about to unfold, for the battle he knew would tear their lives apart. She took another step forward, her heart racing as she made her decision. "I won't let this happen," she said firmly, her voice carrying across the clearing. "I won't stand by and watch the bloodshed." Takakota stepped forward beside her, his warriors moving into position behind him. He was calm, resolute, but Abigail could see the pain in his eyes. He had never wanted this. He had never wanted war. But now, it seemed that was the only path left. "We will not fight unless we must," Takakota said, his voice strong and commanding. "We only want to live in peace, to rebuild what was lost. But we will defend ourselves." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The settlers hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision hanging over them. Abigail could see the conflict in their eyes, the same internal struggle she had felt since the beginning. They had been pushed to the brink, and now they were ready to act. "This doesn't have to be the end," Abigail called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Please listen. We can find a way to live together." We can share this land. We don't have to destroy each other. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the soft crackling of the fire. Then, John stepped forward, his eyes searching hers. You really believe that? He asked, his voice softer now. You think they'll ever accept us? You think we can go back to the way things were? Abigail nodded slowly, her heart heavy with the weight of her belief. I have to believe that, she said quietly. I have to believe there's a way out of this. The tension seemed to hang in the air for a long time, the two sides locked in a standoff, but neither moving forward. Abigail could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The silence stretched, each passing moment feeling like a test of resolve. Finally, Takakota spoke again, his voice calm and measured. If peace is not what you seek, he said, his eyes meeting John's, then we will defend ourselves. But know this, our fight is not with you. It is with the world that has made us enemies. John seemed to soften slightly, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword as he looked at Abigail one last time. I don't want bloodshed, Abigail, but I can't let them take everything we've worked for. With those words, the settlers shifted, their posture tense as they prepared to charge. Takakota's warriors followed suit, readying themselves for what was to come. Abigail's breath caught in her throat as she realized there was no turning back now. This was it. The battle was upon them. But in her heart, she held on to the hope that somehow, through the smoke and the fire, they would find a way to break the cycle of violence, to create something that could live beyond the destruction. As the first blows were struck, Abigail stood frozen in the chaos, her heart heavy with the knowledge that peace, if it ever came, would come at a terrible cost. But she would stand by Takakota. She would stand by the people she had chosen to fight for, even if it meant fighting for a future that seemed impossible.